We're all here for another 27 ounces? Yeah, let's do it.
The mine had been silent for 60 years. No machinery, no crew, no sound except wind slipping through rotten timber and the slow settling of a mountain that seemed to be hiding something beneath it. Most people saw a dead mine, a rusted gate, a collapsed structure, another forgotten scar on the landscape. The kind of place people point at from a passing truck and dismiss with a single word: finished. But Rick Ness didn't see a ruin. He saw a question nobody had answered. Because buried behind that sealed portal was something extraordinary. Nearly $185 million in gold, untouched, concentrated, hidden inside a mountain that generations of miners believed had already given up everything it had. They walked past it without ever realizing what was still there. Not because the gold was gone, but because they didn't yet have the knowledge, the tools, or the perspective to see what was right in front of them. And when Rick Ness stepped into that darkness with nothing but experience, instinct, and a refusal to believe the story was over, he uncovered something that shocked the mining world. Because this discovery didn't just reveal a fortune, it exposed a much bigger possibility. How many abandoned mines across North America still hold secrets nobody ever found? How many fortunes were left behind simply because the wrong questions were being asked? This is the full story of the forgotten mine, the hidden deposit, and the discovery that changed everything. And trust me, this goes far deeper than the headlines ever told you. So, before we break open 60 years of silence, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because every week we uncover forgotten stories, hidden discoveries, and the secrets history almost left behind. Now let's get into it. What people think they know about Rick Ness is only part of the picture. Most viewers see a tough, hands-on miner with a larger-than-life personality, the kind of guy who works shoulder to shoulder with his crew instead of barking orders from the sidelines. Someone who feels every setback personally and treats every victory like just another day on the job. That image is real, but it barely scratches the surface of who he actually is. What television doesn't always show is the technical mindset underneath it all. Rick Ness didn't randomly wander into mining because it looked exciting on camera. Mining was part of his world long before the cameras arrived. Over years in the field, he built a deep understanding of hard rock gold systems, how deposits form underground, how they shift over time, how they disappear from sight, and most importantly, how older mining operations misunderstood what they were looking at because of the limitations of their era. And that detail is the key to everything that happened next. For decades, mining across North America relied on instinct, experience, brute labor, and whatever technology existed at the time. When miners struck gold, they followed it as far as they could. But their understanding of underground geology was primitive compared to modern standards. Concepts like fault displacement, hydrothermal systems, and the three-dimensional structure of ore zones simply weren't understood the way they are today, which means a lot of old mines weren't abandoned because they were empty. They were abandoned because operators ran out of money, gold prices crashed, equipment failed, or the geology became too confusing to solve with the tools they had. In many cases, the gold never disappeared. The miners just lost track of where it went. Rick Ness understood that better than most people in the industry. To him, abandoned mines weren't dead locations. They were unfinished puzzles. If you could identify a site with real remaining potential and combine modern geological analysis with modern equipment, you weren't starting from scratch. You were continuing work that another generation had been forced to abandon. For years, he searched for the right opportunity. Eventually, he found it behind a rusted gate on a forgotten mountainside. The mine itself had operated from the late 1800s into the early 1960s. Over those decades, it produced substantial amounts of gold under several different owners. But the final shutdown didn't happen because the ore body had run dry. It happened because miners encountered a major fault deep underground, one that disrupted the gold-bearing zone they had been chasing. At the gold prices of the time, solving that geological problem simply wasn't worth the cost. So they sealed the entrance and left. The fault was real. The disruption was real. But the conclusion they reached was wrong. What those miners couldn't fully understand, with the science available at the time, was that the gold system hadn't ended at all. The fault had shifted the ore body sideways, moving it into ground their tunnels never touched. Beyond that break in the rock was an even richer continuation of the deposit, hidden in untouched ground that had never been drilled or explored. In other words, they had walked away from nearly $185 million in gold because they lacked the tools to see where the deposit had moved. Rick Ness did not have that limitation. And that brings us to the secret hidden inside the mountain. Because in mining, forgotten doesn't mean mysterious. It doesn't mean the records vanished or the history was erased. In fact, this mine was documented in incredible detail. Production reports, engineering notes, hand-drawn survey maps, assay results, operational records stretching across decades, all of it still existed in archives and geological databases. The information was never missing. What was missing was the right question. Before Rick Ness ever entered the mine, he spent 8 months studying every piece of historical material he could get his hands on. Old production figures, assay reports, underground maps sketched generations earlier by engineers who understood the mine only within the limits of their time. But Rick didn't simply accept the conclusions those men reached. He went back to the raw data itself. Then he ordered a complete modern reinterpretation of the property using current geological modeling and structural analysis. The goal wasn't to prove the ore body continued. He already believed it did. The real challenge was figuring out exactly where the fault had moved it. Direction, distance, depth. That was the question that would change everything. The reinterpretation process lasted nearly 3 months. When the final analysis came back, it pointed to a specific target beyond the fault line, an untouched section of ground the original miners had never reached. More importantly, it showed that the zone could still be accessed using much of the existing underground infrastructure with the right modifications. The target was there. The geological theory made sense. And when the old production records were compared against the new structural model, the evidence suggested something remarkable. The displaced ore body on the far side of the fault might actually be richer than the material the mine had originally produced. Might be. And in mining, that single phrase separates a fortune from an empty hole in the ground. The only thing that closes that gap is drilling. So Rick Ness drilled. The first hole was aimed directly into the projected zone identified by the new model. When the assay results came back, the numbers were so high the samples had to be tested again. Not because anyone thought the lab made a mistake, but because results like that demand confirmation. The second test confirmed everything. Then came the second drill hole, pushed deeper to test how far the mineralization extended underground. The grades came back even stronger. The third hole tested the width of the system. That was when the scale of the discovery started to change. The mineralized zone wasn't just slightly larger than expected. It was dramatically wider than the geological model predicted. wide enough to completely transform the economics of the project. By the end of the drilling program, the outline of the hidden deposit was becoming clear. This wasn't some narrow vein, buried deep underground, that would cost a fortune to mine. It was a broad, continuous body of mineralization with strong grades and relatively straightforward access. The sealed-off section of the mountain, abandoned for 6 decades, was beginning to reveal what had been hidden behind it all along. Nearly $185 million in gold had been sitting untouched inside that rock while the world forgot the mine even existed. And now the mountain was finally giving it back. In reality, moments like this in mining rarely happen all at once. There's no dramatic explosion of certainty, no single instant where everything changes. Confidence builds slowly, piece by piece, until eventually the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. For Rick Ness, that moment came during the underground mapping phase that followed the drilling campaign. Once the results were strong enough to justify further development, he and his team entered the old workings themselves. And this is where the forgotten story of the mine became real. The tunnels carved by miners decades earlier were still standing. In stable, hard rock conditions, a properly built mine can survive astonishingly well even after a century of abandonment. The air underground was stale. The old support timbers had aged dark with time. Rusted machinery from another era still sat where workers had left it decades earlier. But the rock remained solid. Rick moved through those tunnels alongside a geologist, examining every exposed wall and every blasted face. They studied the alteration patterns, traced the veins, and followed the exact path the original miners had taken while chasing the ore body underground. And eventually, they reached the point where everything had stopped. The fault zone. You could see the change instantly. The structure broke apart. The continuity disappeared. On the side, the original miners had been following. The gold-bearing system simply ended, shifted somewhere beyond their reach. Rick reportedly stood there in silence for a long time. Then he looked back down the drift, through the darkness of tunnels, abandoned for 60 years, and quietly said something his crew never forgot. They were right here. They just didn't know how close they were. The underground mapping confirmed what the structural reinterpretation had predicted from the beginning. The fault displacement matched the model almost perfectly. The target zone beyond the break was exactly where modern geology said it should be. The drilling had already proven the gold existed. Now they understood the geometry of the system, the orientation of the ore body, and the exact approach needed to reach it safely. The development plan came together quickly after that. A new heading would be driven directly through the fault zone at the proper angle to intercept the displaced deposit. This time, the operation would use modern ventilation systems, reinforced ground support, updated mining equipment, and a geological understanding built from more than a century of accumulated data about the mountain itself. Development officially began. It took 4 months to cut through the fault zone that had defeated the original operators decades earlier. 4 months of drilling, blasting, and advancing through the same geological barrier that once forced the mine to close forever. Then the heading finally broke through into the ore body, and the numbers exceeded expectations again. The grades were even stronger than the drilling had suggested. The thickness of the zone matched the wider intersections identified during the 3rd drill hole. The deposit was exactly where the model predicted it would be, and the amount of gold being exposed quickly reached the point where independent verification became mandatory. When the final resource estimate was completed, the result stunned the industry. approximately $185 million in measured and indicated gold resources sitting inside a mine the world had abandoned 60 years earlier. On the evening the final numbers were confirmed, Rick Ness walked out of the portal just as the mountain was disappearing into dusk. The ridgeline still held the last traces of sunlight, while the valley below faded into shadow. He didn't celebrate the way most people imagine. Instead, he stood there quietly for a few moments, looking at the rebuilt head frame, the ventilation systems, the compressors, the haul trucks, all the machinery that had spent 4 months turning a theory into reality. Then he turned around and went back underground. Another shift was starting, and in many ways, that's the real meaning behind this entire story. Because if you step back from the gold, from the sealed tunnel, from the $185 million hidden beneath 60 years of silence, the story stops being about mining altogether. It becomes something much bigger than that. What makes this story powerful is that it reaches far beyond mining. This isn't only about gold buried inside a mountain. It's about the way human knowledge evolves over time and how entire generations can mistake temporary conclusions for permanent truth. The miners who originally worked that mountain were not incompetent, far from it. They built a productive operation that lasted for decades. They extracted real gold, created real value, and made decisions that were completely logical based on the information available to them at the time. When the fault zone interrupted the ore body they had been following, they did what almost any mining company in that era would have done. They shut the portal, abandoned the workings, and moved on. From their perspective, the mountain had already given up everything it had to offer, except it hadn't. And they were not wrong because they lacked skill. They were wrong because the geological science of their time had not advanced far enough to explain what had happened beyond that fault. The understanding required to track displaced hydrothermal gold systems simply did not exist yet. The knowledge that eventually uncovered $185 million in gold had not been invented when those miners walked away. It exists now, and that pattern repeats itself everywhere, in mining, in medicine, in physics, in technology, in every field where knowledge slowly builds over generations. Problems that once seemed impossible suddenly become solvable because modern tools can answer questions older generations never had the ability to ask. That means archives are full of unfinished stories, old reports, forgotten studies, abandoned conclusions reached by intelligent people doing the best they could with the knowledge available in their era. All of it waiting for someone to revisit it with a different perspective. That's exactly what Rick Ness did. He took a century's worth of records from a mine everyone else had dismissed and looked at them through the lens of modern geology. And the mountain responded with a modern answer, a $185 million answer. But the most fascinating part of this entire story is also the most uncomfortable. Nothing about the mine was truly hidden. The production records were available. The geological surveys existed. The engineering reports clearly documented where the miners had stopped and exactly where the fault disrupted the ore system. Anyone could have accessed the information. It sat quietly in archives for 60 years. The science needed to reinterpret the geology wasn't new either. By the time Rick Ness examined the property, modern understanding of fault displacement in hydrothermal gold systems had already existed for decades. It was established geology, taught in universities, and used in exploration projects around the world. It simply had never been applied to this mine. Not to these records. Not to this mountain. For 60 years, The data sat there. The science existed. And $185 million remained trapped underground, waiting for somebody to connect the two. And what finally bridged that gap was not luck. It wasn't unlimited money. It wasn't some superhuman level of intelligence. It was curiosity, the willingness to challenge an old conclusion instead of automatically accepting it as final. People know Rick Ness as a hard worker, a relentless miner, willing to outwork almost anyone around him. That reputation is deserved. But the discovery itself didn't begin with machinery or drilling equipment or months of underground labor. It started in silence, in an archive room, in 8 months spent studying forgotten documents and asking a simple question no one else had bothered to ask anymore. What if the old conclusion was incomplete? That is what unlocked the mountain. And honestly, that may be the biggest lesson in this entire story. Because there are forgotten mines everywhere, not just underground. Every industry has them. Every field of study has them. Old assumptions people stopped questioning years ago. Problems everyone decided were solved, impossible, or no longer worth revisiting. Most people pass those things the same way they pass a rusted mine gate. They see something outdated, finished, a dead end. But the people who make real discoveries tend to see something different. They see an unanswered question. Rick Ness looked at that abandoned mountain and refused to believe the story was over. He went back to finish a conversation another generation had been forced to leave unfinished. The mountain answered with $185 million in gold. But the real value of the story has nothing to do with money. It's the reminder that abandoned conclusions are not always permanent truths. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the right person with the right tools and the right perspective to come back and ask the question one more time. The mine was forgotten. The answer was not. It was waiting. Waiting for someone stubborn enough, patient enough, and curious enough to listen carefully to what the past was still trying to say. Rick Ness listened, and after 60 years of silence, the mountain finally spoke back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Every week, we dig through forgotten histories, hidden discoveries, and untold stories that never made the headlines. And trust me, the next one is already waiting.